Western media would have you believe that Russia is the only country that Burkina Faso is deepening ties with. Anytime they happen to mention Burkina Faso and President Traore, the articles and publications do not fail to mention how Traore ditched the West for Russia. But that is simply not true. Aside from Russia, Burkina Faso, under the leadership of President Traore, has deepened diplomatic relations with several other countries, including Turkey, Iran, China, and North Korea, as well as several African and Latin American countries. And recently, Traore has added another country to the list. We are talking about Cuba. A few weeks ago, Burkina Faso and Cuba signed a major deal, which is historic because it's the first time something like that is happening. So the question is, why did Cuba decide to sign a major investment deal with Burkina Faso? What will both countries gain? Let's find out. On Wednesday, September 4th, 2024, the Burkinabe Minister Delegate in charge of regional cooperation, Mrs. Stella Eldine Kabore, received the Ambassador Extraordinaire of Cuba to Burkina Faso, Mrs. Nadieska Navarro, to the capital of Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. Speaking at the meeting, the ambassador revealed that she had to come to exchange with the minister regarding opportunities for cooperation between the Republic of Cuba and Burkina Faso. The ambassador was accompanied by a third partner, delegates from the Luxembourg Agency for Development Operations. She said that Cuba is interested in developing cooperation projects in different areas in Burkina Faso. The ambassador went on to explain that these areas will be determined and identified by all the parties involved, but will ensure that the areas are of priority to Burkina Faso. In her own words, "We can develop the projects in a trilateral way. That is, Cuba will bring the expertise and Luxembourg will take care of the financial resources." In response, the Burkinabe delegate minister praised the excellent relations between Burkina Faso and Cuba and the impending investment to be made by Cuba and Luxembourg. She went on to state that Cuba will have to work with the different Burkinabe ministries and departments to determine projects that will be beneficial to the Burkinabe people. This is a very awesome development for Burkina Faso and its citizens. Now, even though this will be the first time that Burkina Faso and Cuba will sign a deal, it wouldn't interest you to know that Burkina Faso and Cuba relations did not start today. In fact, Burkina Faso and Cuba have had a very good diplomatic relationship for more than 4 decades. This relationship started in 1975, and it has been beneficial to both countries. It's no wonder then that last year, both countries celebrated 48 years of bilateral relations. During all these years, Cuba has contributed to the training of doctors for Burkina Faso, while Burkina Faso has backed Cuba's demand at the United Nations about the necessity to lift the over 60-year U.S. economic, commercial, and financial blockade of the island nation. As you can see, both Cuba and Burkina Faso share a lot in common. You see, Cuba, like Burkina Faso and several other countries, including Russia, is suffering from serious economic sanctions imposed by the U.S. But for Cuba, the situation is worse because the sanctions have been in place for the past 60 years. Despite the fact that the UN has appealed to the U.S. more than 31 times to remove the sanctions, these sanctions still remain in place. As you can imagine, the sanctions have hit the island nation severely, increasing the cost of living and leading to shortages of essential items. Since its introduction on February 3, 1962, the blockade has had devastating repercussions on the Cuban economy, with losses estimated at over $144 billion between 1962 and 2020. Several sectors have suffered considerable damage, including education, foreign trade, and industry, amounting to several billion dollars in just 1 year. But that's not all. The U.S. government reinforced the blockade, added new sanctions, and even placed Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism without any proof. These measures were widely condemned by the international community, including the United Nations General Assembly, but they didn't change anything. The U.S. simply did that like it does with other countries, because it could. Of course, the U.S. cited human rights violations, communist tendencies, and regional instability as the primary catalyst behind the ongoing economic sanctions. But the fact is that the U.S. is simply punishing Cuba for supporting the Soviet Union all those years ago. Now, aside from this connection with Burkina Faso in terms of sanctions, Cuba also shares the same ideology with Burkina Faso in terms of fighting for sovereignty and freedom. In fact, Cuba has always stood in solidarity with oppressed nations, particularly in Africa. During the Cold War, for instance, Cuba played a key role in supporting several African liberation movements, providing not just military support, but also medical assistance as well as education and training. So, if you think about it deeply, this recent investment in Burkina Faso is simply a continuation of its legacy in Africa. The only difference is that it's not providing military, but economic support. However, unlike the West, which thinks only of financial investments, Cuba is doing something different. The island nation is bringing its expertise, its world-renowned healthcare system, its cutting-edge biotechnology, and its renewable energy technology to Burkina Faso. It is interesting that despite the economic limitations on Cuba, Cuba still excels in these areas and has chosen to help Burkina Faso lay the foundation of sustainable growth in these areas. The fact is that Cuba is an example and inspiration to African countries that it is possible to break away from the cycle of dependence on Western aid. Cuba's investment also shows that African countries can build partnerships that are based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. So, what does Cuba benefit from this investment? As we said, the Cuba-Burkina Faso relation is based on mutual benefits, meaning that both countries will gain from this investment. By investing in Burkina Faso, Cuba is strengthening its diplomatic ties with Africa, particularly countries that have shared a history of resistance against colonialism and Western imperialism. The investment also helps Cuba to diversify its foreign economic engagement, given the fact that it has been isolated due to U.S. sanctions. By focusing on sectors like healthcare, biotechnology, and renewable energy, Cuba can create new revenue streams and reduce its economic dependency on other regions. But is it surprising that Cuba is investing in Burkina Faso? The answer is no, and do you know why? It's because of Thomas Sankara. You see, when Thomas Sankara came to power, he identified himself as a revolutionary and was inspired by Cuba's Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Sankara created the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, an idea that was taken from Cuban leader Fidel Castro, whose Committees for the Defense of the Revolution had been created as a form of revolutionary vigilance. It's no wonder that he is called Africa's Che Guevara. Sankara, like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, was a revolutionary loved by his people but hated by the West. French President François Mitterrand once called Sankara a troublesome man after having a discussion with him. The West, particularly France, did not like him for a couple of reasons. One, Sankara revealed through his speeches and interviews that Burkina Faso no longer followed directions from Paris, Washington, or other Western capitals. Second, he asserted that Burkina Faso would assert its sovereignty by establishing relations with any state in the world, including those considered hostile to the West, such as Cuba, China, North Korea, and the Soviet Union. Thirdly, in accordance with his revolutionary ideals, Sankara stated that Burkina Faso would solidarize with, and sometimes directly assist, oppressed peoples and liberation movements across the globe. And fourthly, Burkina Faso would press for genuine Pan-African unity to be expressed through concrete action by African governments and peoples, not just with occasional declarations. It's no wonder then that he was killed by France with the help of his close confidant, Blaise Compaoré. Ibrahim Traore is, however, following in the footsteps of Sankara in building relationships with countries that the West has issues with. Like Sankara, Traore believes that the West does not have any right to dictate which country it should ally with. This is a clear stance that Burkina Faso is a sovereign country and can do what it chooses to do. What do you think will be the reaction of the West to this recent news? Well, there's no doubt that the West will have a problem with Burkina Faso deepening ties with Cuba because the West expects that countries of the global South should not ally with countries that it has an issue with. But the fact is that it really doesn't matter what the West thinks, because from the beginning, President Traore has taken a clear stance that he doesn't care what the West thinks. What is important to President Traore is that Burkina Faso regains its total freedom and sovereignty from the West. What do you think? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.